Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the Babylon podcast. Today I'm speaking with Dr. Eric Kaufmann. He's a professor of politics at Birkbeck College, University of London. He's authored books such as White Shift, Shall the Religious Inherit the Earth, and Rise and Fall of Anglo-America. He's an adjunct fellow at the Manhattan Institute and a senior fellow at Policy Exchange. We talk about his recent report on academic freedom, what to do about activism in the academy, whether or not there is a religious aspect to what has been dubbed wokeness, and much more. Eric is someone I've been following for quite some time now, so it's great to be able to speak with him. We're also trying out a new format for the podcast, as you'll notice once we get started, so let's see how it goes. Anyways, I hope you enjoy the episode.
But if I say the wrong thing, I may not get promoted, I may not get something published, I may not get a grant, I may not have a nice social atmosphere at work. So these are all different levers that can be pulled if your opinions are the wrong ones.
All right, so today I want to welcome Dr. Eric Kaufmann to the Babylon podcast. Dr. Kaufmann, thank you so much for joining me.
Great to be here, Vincent.
Yeah, so this is I'm really excited to have this conversation with you because I think I've tweeted out recently, and you subsequently followed me because of that tweet, that you've managed to diagnose a problem that I've recognized in the academy for quite some time, but I couldn't quite really find good enough reasons to believe what I felt like I believed to be true. So I started going to university a few years ago, and I noticed that there was this strange culture that was being cultivated there, in which there was a particular set of viewpoints that you weren't allowed to have. And whenever I would have conversations with professors, and I've had many of these because I really enjoy talking to my professors, specifically about philosophy, but I sort of got forced to having these conversations about culture as well. And almost always they said the same thing, where they weren't okay with what was going on campus, but they didn't really want to say anything, not because they were necessarily scared that they were going to lose their jobs or anything like that, but rather because they just didn't want to start something that they knew they wouldn't be able to finish for quite some time. And so I came across your work first through trigonometry. You were on a podcast there, and you talked about a report and that I ended up looking into, and your report basically confirmed a lot of my suspicions that was going on in academia. And this report effectively basically stated a lot of professors feel like they can't be open about what their viewpoints are. And we're not talking about really dangerous, nefarious viewpoints. We're talking about pretty boring, fiscally conservative viewpoints that they don't even want to say those sorts of things. So first, before we get into that report, would you mind giving a synopsis of your academic background, your interests, and your writings? Because you've done quite a lot of work.
Well, yeah, I mean, I've been an academic since 1999, so that's, pulling in on a quarter century of work. And I've sort of written a lot on issues of nationalism, ethnic conflict, religion, and population. So that's been sort of a lot of what I've done. In particular, I've been interested in this, where population shifts and national identity collide around issues like immigration and national identity. That's something I've been, I studied during my PhD at the London School of Economics. And then my most recent book, White Shift, which was on populism and polarization, sort of revisited that, but really updating it in light of the populist moment post-2014 in Europe, and then subsequently with the rise of Trump, and then subsequently with what happened thereafter. So that's sort of my academic background. I've also gotten interested as part of that research agenda partly it's population shifts and ethnic change in Western countries. That's certainly the key ingredient behind the new cultural politics. But in addition to that, thrown up by that is, depending on your attitude on that change, this then becomes a moral issue. And so it's now the sort of culture wars dimension, which is a moralization, I suppose, of politics. And that's and that brings in the sort of evolution of the left from a class-based to an identity-based thing, and once it's an identity left, becoming ever more institutionalized and radicalized in some way. And so that kind of leads on to then this question of impingement on freedom of expression and academic freedom. And so I've done a few reports, 3 reports, 2 in the UK with Policy Exchange, and then 1 with the Center for the Study of Partisanship and Ideology on the US, Canada, and the UK, just looking at academic attitudes towards, for example, firing controversial professors, discriminating against conservatives, these sorts of questions around punishment for speech, and on the other hand, political discrimination for speech, and trying to map out where the attitudes and the public opinion amongst the faculty, to some degree, graduate students, what that looks like, and how academia has really shifted. Even though it was always relatively left-wing, it's shifted substantially more so since the 60s, and particularly since the 80s and 90s. So just sort of documenting that, and the sort of increasingly restrictive atmosphere there is on campus and on faculties, really, and the ideological conformity that's developed. But I think this is also part of a wider societal movement. It's spilling over clearly, not just on campus, but to, large corporations and so on.
Yeah. And I must say, White Shift, I have the book right here, is a fantastic, extremely dense read. So I recommend people take notes. I made the mistake of, when I first started reading heavily, I made the mistake of not taking notes. And I was reading pretty large books like Steven Pinker's books, and I would never take notes. And now I can't tell you at all what that book was largely about. So I recommend people take notes, especially with the book that is really insightful and detailed as White Shift is. It really is a great read, and I recommend people look at it, as well as your previous book. One of my favorite ones that I think you've written 3, right? 3 books in total?
3 major ones.
I really also liked Shall the Religious Inherit the Earth, which hopefully we'll have time to also touch on towards the end of the podcast. But for now, I really want to ask you about this report that you did. And as I said, really confirmed a lot of my suspicions based on what was going on university campuses. So what would you say is a good way to characterize this report, and what were some of the key major findings from it?
Well, really, what I was interested in was sort of taking the temperature of faculty opinion, and to some degree graduate student opinion, first to understand, okay, first of all, what is the political split in academia? We already know that more or less. There are other studies that can tell us that more accurately. I just found roughly a similar break, something like 14-1 in terms of the left to right ratio in the social sciences and humanities amongst academics. That's roughly in line with other studies. Again, looking at top 100 institutions in the US, for example, and Canada, similar breakdown. And what you see is that there's really two threats to academic freedom. One is sort of direct, in the form of punishment for speech. So that could be you being fired, it could be you being demoted, or you simply being threatened to not publish this, take that down, don't say this, or being disciplined for what you've said. So punishment involves, 1 in 3 American academics and graduate students have either been disciplined or threatened with discipline, and which is considerably higher than roughly 1 in 10 across all of academia. So that's a significant share, whereas a lot of people were saying, well, you have a few no platformings, a few high-profile firings. It's a drop in the bucket compared to, 1 million people working in higher ed. Yeah, and that's true. That's a fair point, although I don't think it's a nothing. I mean, if it were, for example, a homosexual speaker or a black speaker or something like that, I think we would be having a very serious conversation, even about 1 or 2 incidents. But even when we bracket that, the much bigger problem is not these high-profile incidents. It is this sort of climate of fear and the chilling effect. So, for example, if you are in a political minority, like you're a conservative or a gender-critical feminist, or even actually a centrist, you are much more likely to say you self-censor. So in social sciences and humanities faculties in the US, amongst conservatives, it's 7 in 10 saying they're self-censoring. Amongst centrists, it's almost 1 in 2. So which is much higher than amongst those on the left, where it's something like 20% or a little less than that. So you're getting a majority of this political minority who are self-censoring. And then you have political discrimination. I mean, this is the two prongs are really fear of being disciplined, so punishment, and then discrimination, which is, okay, I may not be afraid of getting fired or disciplined, but if I say the wrong thing, I may not get promoted, I may not get something published, I may not get a grant, I may not have a nice social atmosphere at work. So these are all different levers that can be pulled if your opinions are the wrong ones. And in fact, what I find is, again, if you ask people, would you hire a Trump supporter, a known Trump supporter for a job? 40% of American academics say no. This is sort of, in the UK, it's about 1 in 3 wouldn't hire a known Brexit voter. And when you ask people about, would you mark down an academic journal article or a grant application, promotion application, if it was conservative leaning, you get numbers between 15 and 45% roughly. And there have been a number of studies that corroborate this. So there's really substantial political discrimination. And this is, by the way, so if you say about, even if it's 25, 30% of academics who would discriminate against a conservative in hiring or a paper or a grant application, if you have to get through a panel or a committee or a group of referees that's sort of 3, 4, 5, by the time you've got 3 or 4 or 5 referees, and given that academia is 14-1 left to right, the math is so strongly against you that you'd be a fool to sort of open up as a conservative, even if you were one. Whereas if you were on the left, actually there's as much benefit from opening up as being on the left as there is a negative, because there's so few conservatives who will discriminate against you. That's not really a real risk. So punishment and discrimination leading to self-censorship, leading to chilling, what that does is creates a hostile environment. So again, about 7 in 10 conservatives will say their departments are hostile environments for their beliefs. What that hostile environment then does is it influences graduate students who can pick up on that, who know that environment is there. And I've surveyed master's level students, for example. Master's students already know that academia is a left-wing place, that if they are conservative, that it's not a place that'll fit their beliefs. And so they'll select away from an academic track. That leaves academia more relatively purified of conservatives. So it essentially is reproducing not a perfectly closed ideological bubble, but a relatively narrow range of opinion with limited viewpoint diversity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that second prong is interesting because that's what almost everyone that I've spoken with takes into consideration when writing English essays. When there's a certain set of viewpoints that you're supposed to write about. When, for instance, I think on the most recent English essay, the final one that I had to turn in for my general education requirements, I had to specifically write about a social justice cause that was deeply important to me. And I don't really have one, so I had to make one up, and I obviously couldn't write I obviously couldn't write arguing against this sort of mentality, and I couldn't write about something that I actually wanted to believe in. So you have to adopt this persona. And so it becomes a sort of joke amongst many undergraduates who are still in English classes that you have to be as woke as possible in these English departments in order to get the best grade. And it's funny when you talk about it with your friends, but when it shouldn't be that way in the first place. Why do you have to fake who you are in order to get a passing grade or hope that you get a better grade in that class? It really is concerning. And the fact that it's 13-1 now, where it used to be around 3-1, is a huge deal. That's hugely concerning. And you sort of basically already alluded to it earlier, but the idea is what happened there. This general culture in which originally it was 3-1, and then is it that left-leaning viewpoints or far left-leaning viewpoints sort of already kind of hold this very censorship idea or this very tribalistic idea within itself, that it sort of created this snowballing effect where it was 3-1, then it becomes 4-1, then it becomes 5-1, and now you're at 3-1. And so how did it get this bad? Is it just a culture of intimidation, or is it that, one of the arguments is that, well, the academy has always been left leaning. There's this joke that reality has a liberal bias. I think Stephen Colbert said that. Or is it just that liberals, the liberal viewpoint is the correct one, and academics tend to be the first ones to get there?
Well, no, I mean, you mentioned earlier that, there have been studies on political views of academics going back to the 1950s. So we have kind of a picture of what's happened over time in both Britain and the US from the early mid 60s onwards. In the sort of early to mid 60s, it was 1.5 to 1 in the university as a whole, left to right. Within the social sciences and humanities, it was about 3 to 1. And that 3 to 1 ratio is now at about, as you said, 13 or 14. It sort of seems to have happened in two waves. One wave happens from kind of the late 60s to the mid 80s. There's not a huge amount of change. There's some change as that 60s hippie generation is entering the gates of academia with there was a big expansion of the universities in the 60s, late 60s. Then there's another burst, the big burst from the sort of 80s, 90s, when political correctness, the term, emerges. Then you kind of almost see this other big shift. And now we're in a situation where academia as a whole is about 6 to 1 left, right. And social sciences and humanities is sort of 13, 14. So academia has not always been left. Now, in terms of this idea of reality having a liberal slant, well, I mean, you just have to think about something like, is gender a continuum, or are all differences between groups down to racism, or might there just be some other explanations that you're allowed to have? I mean, it's very clear that on a lot of questions, this is very ideological. It's not really what the science is telling. In fact, the science is now more than ever colliding with the social justice ideology. So reality, if anything, has a sort of anti-social justice bent much of the time. It's not to say that the right obviously doesn't have problems, particularly if you were to go back in time, and certainly there are religious viewpoints that would collide with science and so on. That's very much the case. But I think right now in the academy, yeah, it's definitely not. It's ideology trumping science in a way. Mm-hmm. Now, I would say there's been an anti-free speech aspect to left-wing ideology for a long time. You could see not just Herbert Marcuse and this idea of repressive tolerance, that you shouldn't tolerate conservatives in a way, but also if you look at the evolution of the student movements in the 60s, Nathan Glazer, who was my doctoral examiner actually, who was writing about this in 1969, about the student revolts in the late 60s, said, they started out as the Berkeley free speech movement. They were all in favor of freedom to express opposition to the Vietnam War, and they were very much in favor of freedom. Once they attained a position of influence and power, they turned against freedom, and they wanted to keep professors who were teaching the wrong things, not allowing them to teach, not allowing military recruiters on campus and corporations. So became very authoritarian very quickly. And I think that sort of tells you that the commitment to free speech was only really instrumental, wasn't core to the belief system. Now what we've seen is simply that mentality institutionalized and deepened, more activists in the system, spreading it, innovating in social media, for example, new terms like microaggression and all of that. So it has developed, and it's always, I think, been illiberal, essentially. It's been a sort of progressive illiberalism that prioritizes redistribution of power, wealth, self-esteem over freedom. And we're just seeing that formalized because their power has grown to such an extent they can afford to be much more brazen. The other thing I would say in terms of your English class is a number of different authors, Cass Sunstein is one of them, John Ellis is another, have written that, when you get a saturation, when the viewpoint diversity drops beyond a certain point, the incentive is not to try and innovate at the center between two viewpoints to come up with an innovative synthesis, but rather to sort of demonstrate that you're kind of fundamentalist about the views everyone holds, like anti-racism. So I'm going to be a ultra anti-racist by saying that, you using the term master bedroom or wearing a sombrero is racism, right? So it's all about, all the energy goes into the extremists, and that's kind of, and people's view of what's normal shifts. So Sunstein talks about, when you have 3 judges and they're all Republicans, the decisions are more extreme than when there's 2 Republican judges and a Democrat, even though the two Republicans, they have the majority in any case, they can still do what they want. But just because you have to actually talk to somebody on the other side, that moderates your views. That moderation is largely gone because of the loss of viewpoint diversity in academia.
Mm-hmm. One of the interesting statistics that was brought out within that report was that it's only around 1 in 10 academics who actually support these sorts of cancellation campaigns. So the majority don't. And is the solution to this to try to convince these academics to speak out and say, if all of you speak out and it becomes widely apparent that the majority of academics don't support this pestilential spread of activism that has infiltrated the academy, if most people recognize that, then you probably aren't going to lose your job. You probably aren't going to run into issues. Is it a matter of just convincing these, or is it a matter of getting other people in positions of power that don't hold these sorts of activistic views? What's sort of the solution to this?
Well, I wish it were as simple as saying 90% of academics oppose cancellation. Actually, that's not really what the numbers show. What the numbers show is there's only really 10% that are true believers that have drunk the Kool-Aid and want to sort of cancel anyone who's got a controversial view around race, gender, sexuality. But then you've got 40 to 50% who are kind of torn. They kind of like the idea of what I call cultural socialism, this idea of redistribution of power, wealth amongst identity groups to achieve a situation of equality. They like that idea, but on the other hand, they are uncomfortable with some of the tactics and the coercion and the authoritarianism. But even on a survey, they won't say they oppose it. Mm-hmm. So they're actually not, I don't think they can articulate, I don't think they are actually firmly on the free speech side. I think they're kind of torn between their progressive values and their free speech commitments. Then you've got the 40 to 50% who really are opposed, and there is where the sort of fear factor would be playing the main role. But I think we still have to win the battle of ideas. I think if it were the case that 90% of them opposed cancellation, I think you could get enough people to speak up out of that. But I think we have to win the battle of ideas. Now, in terms of solutions, as I didn't mention it in the report because I didn't make it a policy report, but in my City Journal, I did a piece in City Journal where I put the policy thoughts, and also in my UK reports. My view is the universities can't reform. That essentially, once institutions reach a certain tipping point ideologically, it's not possible for them to reform, because the small number of activists, that 10%, the force multiplication they get through both the people who are conflicted and the people who are scared, it's like 5 times plus multiplication. So they really can really control the discourse. The only way this is stopped is through external intervention. Now, it may be that some private universities have a trustee and donors and trustees can have some influence. I've yet to really see that make much of a difference. I think it may, but ultimately I think it's tough for the private universities. I think it's more in the public sector. The public sector universities who are under the control of state governments, there you can use pressure from state governments. State governments can put pressure on the state universities to essentially not do any of these things. In Britain, for example, the universities are all public, more or less. The government has a regulator of the university sector. The Conservative government is now, they adopted 5 of our 7 recommendations, but they've created an office which will be an academic free speech, essentially czar, who will oversee an office that will enforce. Universities will just have to obey the law as it exists. There's some cleaning up of the law to make it clear that academic freedom comes as a higher priority than terms like emotional safety. which, by the way, the government explicitly mentioned in its bill, or university reputation. None of those things can be used to shut down your academic freedom. So you have to actually be a bit legal about this. You've got to then get personnel into the right government bodies who are with the program, and that sort of regulatory approach, I think, is necessary. I don't think you can rely on lawsuits, because lawsuits are expensive. They rely on an individual being willing to risk their time and money to go after the university. It's just very, very difficult, and it's not realistic. It doesn't. Most people are just going to say, "I'm not going to bother. I'm just going to shut up." So the chilling effects are not going to be lifted by a sort of lawsuit approach. You need to ideally have a government body breathing down the necks of the universities, proactively applying the law, so the universities are not essentially allowed to. They're not allowed to violate academic freedom, and if they do, they're in line for fines. All of this has been specified in the new UK legislation, which is just gone through. I shouldn't say it's just gone through, it's on its second reading, but I think this will be a game changer. Already it's changed the atmosphere greatly. A lot of people feel the difference in terms of they know universities are going to be very reluctant to essentially violate academic freedom. I think that's the only way, I'm afraid. I think that hand-wringing and all the great work that's done by people in the media, by Heterodox Academy, and imploring universities to embrace viewpoint diversity, none of that really is going to cut much ice when it comes to those key committees, the communications departments, the HR departments. They're the ones who really are going to run the show. So I just don't think this is going to happen organically, which isn't great for the private universities. I accept that. I think that it's going to be tough for them, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Sorry not to be more encouraging.
Right. No, I'm very pessimistic about this stuff myself. Yeah. What role does activism play in the academy, if it plays any role at all? Because my assumption would be that the reasoning behind why academic departments such as the economics field or the physics field or chemistry field, the reason why they don't tend to be as ideologically driven as the sociological departments are is because it's very hard to make a normative claim in regards to physics or in regards to chemistry. But with sociology, that's all it is, because not only are you dealing with how do people react with one another, but that it kind of also comes along with how we should react with one another. And so it's rife for activism. That's where basically people make moral judgments on. So is there any role for activism at all, or should the way it be would be that in sociology or whatever discipline that we're talking about within the humanities, we just try to explain things in just a descriptive manner, and then whatever normative claim or whatever morals you want to introduce into it, you do that outside of the academy. That's what our society does. That's what culture does. But within the academy itself, we just have to remain descriptive. Do you think that's the way it should be, or there is some role for activism?
I think that is absolutely the way that it should be. I think that you can certainly have normative differences, which you would be able to defend with analytic political philosophy arguments around premises. Conclusions should follow from premises. Different interpretations of liberalism between, John Locke and so there's plenty of room for those sorts of normative debates. But I don't buy this argument that, there are a lot, certainly in the soft social sciences and humanities, you will always find this argument that people will say, oh yeah, but everything's political and you can't separate values from facts and you can't be empirical without being normative. I think that's a crock largely. I mean, of course, one will influence the other, but essentially if you sign up to the scientific method where it's about measurement, falsification, all views should be potentially falsifiable, then I think you have to defend. You can have whatever view you want, and it may be influenced by your politics, but you will have to defend it using a set of transparent methods, and you have to sign up to that. I think it's once we allow people to sign up to their own methodologies, whether that be postmodernism or some kind of sort of post-colonial anti-science, anti-positivism, then you essentially allow people to wriggle off, get out of that game and play a different game. So I don't think there really is. I mean, there's obviously going to be room for some of those dissenters. You don't want to have none of those people, but I think it's got to be drastically reduced. Now, in the ideal world, and activism, yeah, should be focused on. I mean, yeah, if there is something genuinely awful happening with the university administration, fair enough, But I think that generally speaking, the activism should be off campus. And I think in terms of the fields, well, I think the nature of the subject matter, of course, does play some role. Although economics, I mean, there is a significant left bent even in economics. It's just not as extreme as it is in the soft social sciences and humanities, because you can clearly make a lot of left-wing economic arguments, but a lot of the energy on the left is now identity. So that's going to affect things that are cultural and historical much more. So yeah, they've always been more that way, but I just think with this general shift of academia to the left, it's just more magnified, so that you essentially have no conservatives now in many types of fields. I think the Langberg 2018 study, I think it was anthropology, there were no registered Republicans he could find in any anthropology department. So yeah, I mean, it's just gotten that extreme, and they will then justify it to themselves as, well, those other people are ignorant, and we don't even have to listen to them, right? So through motivated reasoning and confirmation bias, you can believe your bubble is the real world and everyone else is stupid. That is essentially the place where they've gotten to. And also this kind of moralization of politics of, instead of actually justifying views on the basis of evidence and data, it becomes a moral project where you're not just wrong, you're bad and evil. And that becomes second nature to a lot of people because no one's challenging and picking them up on it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, what really worries me about this is that I've always held the academy in high esteem, mainly because I grew up really liking science and physics. And so I was always enamored by the idea that Cavendish Labs in Cambridge is where J.J. Thomson discovered the electron. You have so many Nobel Prizes coming from Cambridge. Just the university institution in general is a great place for scientific insight. It's a great place for discoveries. And that's the way I've always viewed it. And that's why I've always seen it in such high esteem. And I think generally speaking, people viewed it that way for quite some time. You always had this anti-establishment sort of conservative project that appeared. But for the most part, it was a lot more respectable than it is now. And what I'm worried is that now with what's going on in the humanities, what's going on with the intermingling of activism and academics, it's going to no longer be seen that way. It's going to be seen much more differently. And that worries me. I want the academy to be respected. I want it to go back to its roots of scientific discovery. And I want it to have the same rigorous methodology that it originally had. And so what I often wonder is if, in the same way that we wouldn't allow a staunch conservative, young earth creationist to teach a physics class, maybe we shouldn't also allow a postmodernist to teach, because what we're concerned with here is the methodology at how you acquire knowledge. If the way that you are acquiring knowledge to come to your conclusions in physics is way out of whack, you're not following the scientific method, you're not properly publishing peer-reviewed papers, in fact, you're not even following the peer review system, then you're not an academic. That's not what an academic is. By definition, an academic is someone who follows those sorts of rules. But a postmodernist similarly does not follow those rules. So can we be consistent in our logic in saying, well, this young earth creationist should not be teaching a physics class, but this postmodernist can absolutely be teaching a history class? Is it the methodology that we're concerned with, or what am I missing here?
Yeah, that's some really good points. I mean, I'm kind of two minds. I mean, on the one hand, I certainly wouldn't want to get in front of anyone's academic freedom to be a postmodernist. But on the other hand, I think that the way you would do it is through recruitment. So there would be a sense in a department like, okay, what is esteemed and valuable in our discipline is something that is the scientific method. Or if we're talking about the humanities, it might be archive-based historiography, or it might be sort of certain kinds of literary criticism. I mean, clearly it's trickier the more you get into the arts as to what is kind of the objective way of analyzing. But yeah, I think, ideally we would see a decline through attrition as those approaches lost esteem. That's the way it should happen. I think it's very difficult. I wouldn't want to see sort of central administrators kind of dictating anything in terms of existing academics and what they should research, because there's an academic freedom issue. But I think the way it should happen is through attrition and through esteem. But yeah, I think that these, if you look at the academy, I mean, I'm just actually doing a study now, which is not released, but what I can say is that there's a big difference obviously there's a big difference by party. Democrats generally have a very high ranking of academia. Amongst Republicans, there's a big difference between how they rank the sciences and engineering and technology and social sciences and humanities. The trust in the latter is much lower. And I think that's something that's happened increasingly recently, just since 2015, for example. So yeah, I think you're right that part of academia is losing trust. Now, the reality is there's a lot of good work being done in those fields that is rigorous, and the top journals are pretty rigorous. The problem, in a way, is they're focusing on problems that are of interest largely to progressives, not entirely, but they are focusing mainly on those problems. And there's also a large amount of significant amount of very ideological work being published that would never be permitted if it was conservative, for example. But because it's left-wing and radical, it is being permitted. So yeah, it is a big skew. A lot of topics are not being addressed. Anything around the military, for example, would have a lot less interest than inequalities of various kinds. It would be much harder to get published if you were to say, like Arthur Sakamoto, I can't find evidence of anti-Asian discrimination in the labor force. You're not going to be able to publish a paper like that very easily. So there's also a bias in what findings you're going to. It's just going to be much, much more difficult to publish findings that go against the ideological grain. So the whole enterprise of truth-seeking is being warped by ideology, to the point where there are bad results that are eagerly accepted and never challenged, and when you try and replicate them, they don't replicate. It's something that Lee Jussim has pointed to. So yeah, I don't know how we get. There's really no way back from this. I mean, a lot of the policy solutions around academic freedom and preventing people getting fired and disciplined, that you can institute from the government. I mean, they can essentially clamp down on the university so they can't move on that. But when it comes to viewpoint diversity, it's much harder. How are you going to start tilting the balance backward? I think there's a few things you can do. One thing is, I think universities should have to be politically neutral. I mean, this is, they should not be allowed to advocate for political movements like Black Lives Matter or for something like the Remain side in the Brexit referendum. I don't think that should be permissible. Individual academics, fine. They have their freedom. Not administrators, officials, anyone in a sort of administrative capacity. The second thing is, yeah, you have to start trying to cut down on that hostile environment. And so a new ethos of political diversity and non-discrimination also, that should be institutionalized. I think you should not, it should be made very clear, you cannot, for any hiring or promotion or anything, you cannot discriminate along political grounds. That should become part of the ethos of university. So all of those things, I think, are innovations that government can bring. Beyond that, I think I'm also in favor of some slightly more controversial things. It's controversial. So what I would say is this, is that if universities care about diversity and equity for race and gender, what I would say is, okay, if you are going to care about those things, then you're going to have to do the same on politics and ideology. So if you really want to get more faculty of color and female faculty in, that's fine. But anything you do on race and gender in terms of diversity, you've got to do on political diversity. That's the way I would pitch it. So then they could say, well, either we're going to pursue diversity or we're not going to pursue diversity. And if we are not going to pursue diversity, we'll do nothing on politics, but we'll do nothing on race and gender. But if we want to do diversity, you've got to do it on the ideology politics side. So I think that would also introduce a discipline which might bring back some diversity to the academy. But right now it's looking pretty bleak. Yeah. And I worry particularly about I do think that the state funded institutions in the conservative states, but particularly in the conservative states, those probably are where you're going to see more of the academic freedom and some political diversity. I think you're not going to see it as much in the blue states. even with a shift in government.
Hmm. Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree, and I was hoping that you would be able to alleviate some of my more pessimistic views, because I legitimately think I was asked this not too long ago, and I legitimately believe that the this whatever you want to call it, this woke side of it, this activism, whatever preferred word you use, I think they're going to win, and I think they're going to win for two reasons. One is because they've mastered the game of intimidation, and two is they've mastered the game of rhetoric. So it's a lot harder for us to attach ourselves to a meta narrative that is very appealing to someone who doesn't really pay attention. So someone who works a 9 to 5 job, who doesn't really want to look too deeply into this because they have a family to feed or they have exams to complete by the end of the month. They're more focused on that. So they're not going to look too deeply into these issues. And I don't blame them. I think that's perfectly fine. You have to live your life. But these people will just look at the issues on a surface level analysis and they'll say, okay, so that's the anti-racist side. I mean, yeah, of course I'm on the anti-racist side, and they'll adopt those values without really recognizing what that is. They'll look at something like critical race theory and say, well, what is it? Okay, it's analyzing racism through history and power, it seems. Okay, who was against it? Oh, Donald Trump was against it. Of course he was. And so they'll just look at that very easily and they'll adopt those views because they have the best rhetoric out there. The woke side, they say, we are the anti-racist. We are the ones against racism. We are the ones against misogyny. Most people will just see that language and they'll gravitate towards it. Where it's a lot harder for someone like us because we're expecting more. We're saying, well, what do we have? We're the anti-racist. That doesn't sound very good.
Right.
Well, so I think because of that, they're ultimately going to win. And now I'm just waiting until uh, until I have to change my attitudes and change the way I behave around other people within that culture. I was hoping you'd be able to make me feel better about that, but it sounds
Well,
like you're also pessimistic.
it depends. I mean, I think there's always going to be a lively opposition in media, particularly online media and podcasts and things. I mean, subject to obviously. I mean, there could be threats from tech companies and hate speech laws and essentially expanding the meaning of words like hate and transphobia and racism, whatever, in order to shut people down. So there is also a threat, but I don't think it's as immediate as it is in institutions like a corporation or university where the powers are simply much greater. I do, however, think though, you're right. I know Richard Hanania had a piece where he said, the woke left simply cares more, is willing to boycott. They're willing to Twitter mob in a way that the other side isn't, and so they're going to win. And I think there's a lot of truth to that because it's a religious crusade for them, and the other side is more disorganized. But what I would say is that the way that kind of classical liberal and conservative side functions is more through elections and voting. And I do think that if an issue can be elevated, like critical race theory is becoming now an issue. I think I've done some polling on this. I think it's sort of becoming more than a mid-ranked issue for Republican voters, and it's a reasonably high issue even for independents. It's not a non-issue. And so something like critical race theory enters the political lexicon and the political discourse. People may not know what it is, but they certainly will know if kids are being told to be ashamed of being white or something, and they see a story like that. That makes an emotional impact. And so I do think that once these things are politicized, then the game shifts slightly. So what it means is now that if the Republican Party takes this on and starts to make policy and do something about it, for the Democrats to be against it, it's one thing to sort of be dishonest and say that this is racial sensitivity training and it's just learning about slavery or whatever. So that was the initial response, to try and pretend that this is not sort of as pernicious as it is. I don't think that's ultimately flying. I think it's ultimately not working. So if they then come out, if they continue to sort of die on this hill that they're going to defend the right of teachers to, separate white pupils out and shame them and all this sort of stuff, I think then that's going to cost them. And once it starts to cost them electorally, I think the incentive will be there for a more moderate individual to say, look, we've got to actually get behind we have to put a lid on this. We cannot endorse this. And once you move into that dynamic, then change can start to happen. So I do think change is possible from electoral politics. Now, the problem is, how do you penetrate into these institutions that are very powerful? And this is where I think that there has to be, certainly for something like tech, which is what I would consider to be a kind of common carrier and therefore suitable for regulation, or universities that are funded by the government, perhaps even universities that are, taking government loans or government contracts. There are ways in which you can try and compel them to adhere to the First Amendment and civil rights law, for example. So I think there are certainly mechanisms, and I think that if this issue can be elevated in the public conversation and become an electoral issue, that it damages parties that don't support the kind of anti-critical race, sort of anti-woke perspective, then those parties will act. And I think you've seen that even in Britain here, for example, where because of the electoral demographics, it's much harder for the left-wing party to win power by playing the woke card. They've got to be the leaders of the Labour Party here. They want to damp down anything around wokeness. So even though their activists are all in, the leadership says, no, we can't say that, we can't do that, we can't be against academic freedom. And it's that dynamic that we're looking for, is that the sort of center left trying to put a lid on the radical left and say, this is too damaging for us electorally, therefore we have to support freedom of speech. And so that's the route that I think we need to take, coupled with a quite intrusive regulatory approach that's in harmony with the law. I just don't think you can expect some kind of culture shift to occur within the next decade or two, because the young generation is really much less tolerant of these things than the older generation, I'm afraid. So we're only going in a bad direction, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. You mentioned a word there that I want to touch upon, where you said they view this as a religious crusade.
Yeah.
Do you sense some religious manifestation of what's going on within the sort of activism going on? A lot of people will say that there's a lot of similarities between a religion and what's going on when we're talking about original sin and whiteness, when we're talking about even some cult-like things, right, where people will sort of put their pronouns in their bio as a virtue signaling way of telling other people what they believe in and what sort of tribe they're in. Do you sense some of that going on in here as well?
Oh, absolutely. It's at the very core of what wokeness is and what it means. I mean, so the term, people on the left will often get angry and say, wokeness, that's pejorative. Actually, I think it is a real concept and a real empirical phenomenon. So I define it as the sacralization, making sacred of historically marginalized race, gender, and sexual identity groups. Once you come up with this argument that if you offend these groups, you are a transgressor of the sacred, and therefore you must be excommunicated because you're a blasphemer. That is essentially the dynamic. It's not like, oh, you've said something we consider transphobic or racist, therefore you get a light penalty, slap on the wrist, and first offense, okay, don't do it again, back to normal, or a sliding scale of penalties. It's more like, boom, you're gone, cancel. It's this very sort of black and white worldview. And so this is sort of stems from this making sacred of groups. And the view that people of color and perhaps African Americans, there's a hierarchy, but they have a sort of spirituality, a view on a deeper knowledge, a higher moral standing than whites. On the one hand, they're higher. On the other hand, of course, they're lower because they don't have agency. They're fragile. They need protection by whites. Anything that improves in their life will be as a result of whites. So in a way, it's kind of very demeaning on the one hand, but on the other hand, it's sort of, but they are higher up the totem pole of the sacred. So yeah, it's very religious. And then you get a set of rituals. It could be taking the knee, bowing the head, whatever it is, signifying the sort of subservience to others in this hierarchy, right? And so, yeah, I would say it's very religious. And because of that religiosity, it makes it impossible to have a rational discussion on an issue such as, is using the term master of the college or master bedroom racist and colonialist? An activist is not going to sit there and say, let's see, let's measure the effects of this on actual outcomes. And this is why it's so difficult to have a debate over something like the sources of racial income gaps or attainment gaps. You can't sit there and say, well, let's do a multiple regression, and have we accounted for intact families, and have we accounted for the average income of this group when they entered the country as immigrants and their average age. None of this sort of complexity is there. It's all squashed away. It's all got to be racism. So yeah, I think it's just when you adopt this religious worldview and it's all about putting a foot wrong and hypersensitivity around objects of sacredness, then you no longer can see the complexity of the world.
Mm-hmm. Do you believe that the sort of religious manifestation of this is a byproduct of the fact that the younger generations tend to be less religious than the older generations? I know you've argued that in the long run, the religious will inherit the earth, but within academia and within younger, I think there was a poll recently, younger people in the UK, over 50%, don't find any meaning in a higher power. Do you think the reasoning behind why there is a religious manifestation in the first place is because people are becoming less and less religious, at least in the short run here?
I don't know. I don't actually think it's as important as some people think, because you've certainly seen a lot of religious figures who are amongst the wokest, particularly in sort of liberal mainline type denominations. The Anglican Church would be an example here in Britain. Some of the leaders of the Anglican Church were very much buying into, systemic racism-based narratives. I'm not sure whether that religious sensibility insulates you. I think it's orthogonal to that to some degree. I think it's just a matter of this ideology has evolved in a certain way over time. It's shifted from the left has shifted from class to identity. People have been saturated in that, maybe through school, university, certainly through social media, celebrity, pop culture. That's simply in the air they breathe. So I don't think they question that. And a few of them simply are aficionados that take that further. So I guess I see this as to do with socialization. So the younger generations would never have learned about the excesses of communism. They wouldn't have learned about the excesses, certainly, of utopianism in the Cultural Revolution in China. They haven't read George Orwell's 1984. So there's no concept of that, pursuing utopia has led to some really awful things. In fact, it's probably led to more deaths than pursuing some ethno-national kind of purity, which is the big bogeyman that's always sort of flashed out there by the left, white supremacy or that this stalks the land, right? I mean, it's not to say that's a non-issue, but whereas there's tons of learning, you learn all the stories about the Nazis and the movies, slavery, Jim Crow, all of that is sort of these are the stories and the myths that people are steeped in, whereas they aren't steeped in the myths of, millions dying of starvation in the Cultural Revolution, or people being shot by Stalin, killed in the gulags. None of that is understood by people, and certainly the battle for freedom of expression. I mean, that no one knows anything about that history. So what I would say is the myths that the generation grows up with are just myths of the left rather than those of, say, classical liberalism and fears of utopianism. Until that changes, I fear, in the culture, in the schools, we're going to have a problem. So there has to be a balancing where people learn both sides instead of just one side.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I actually 100% agree with you. I've always thought that people were really overselling that idea that this drop in religiosity is only increasing what's going on in the wokeness. Because as you said, I myself, the most woke people I've met have been religious people. Almost, I asked them, and not just people who have religious parents, but people who went to private religious schools, upper middle class, white people who are very devoutly religious. Those have been the most woke people I've met. And the atheists that I've met, I think they tend to be, on average, from my experience, and I could be wrong because this is completely anecdotal, so take what I'm saying with a grain of salt.
Right.
So, but most of them seem to be moderately woke, in the sense that they have woke positions. They will say, I don't like this free speech thing, or sorry, this anti-free speech free speech thing or whatever like that. But what they'll generally say is, but compared to what's going on the right, that's not even a problem. Let's focus on what's going on the right. That seems to have been what most atheists would say, and I'm an atheist myself. I just tend to be anti-woke, and so that to me has always been interesting. My co-host for this podcast, he goes to a liberal church. He's an atheist as well, but he likes going to this liberal church. And recently they've been coming in way farther to the left than he would expect. And I think James Lindsay has also documented many churches in which they are adopting this social justice mantra as well. And I don't know if there's a connection between religiosity and social justice activism at all, or if it's just, as you said, it's this idea of, well, what myths are you being taught when you're a child? And so that to me has always been interesting, because I'll hear someone like Coleman Hughes, who's also an atheist. There's a trend here, as you can see, who's also an atheist. And he says, well, at least what the religious have is a meta narrative. And we can at least sort of use that meta narrative as a weapon against this. But I'm not so sure of that myself. I don't think you can use the meta narrative of, whether we're talking about the Sermon on the Mount or whether we're talking about the Golden Rule. I don't think it's going to be effective in combating this giant academic literature that has emerged since the 90s. And so, yeah, that makes me really pessimistic. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, there are probably some points in which, so forgiveness and humility. I mean, there are probably certain theological points one could argue against the woke thing, but of course that would take some kind of motivation to want to do that. Whereas I think it's far too easy to just blend in aspects of theology with wokeness, because to some degree you can find points of commonality in some of it, in this idea of piety and sacredness and so on. I don't know that there is such a tight relationship, but yeah, clearly the kind of rational scientific type atheists, the Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris type atheists, are going to have no trunk with wokeness, right? So if you are that kind of an atheist, as opposed to a more yoga sort of 1960s spiritual type atheist, then yeah. But no, I think that this has to be taken on its own terms. I do think there is a connection, say, though, between the decline of some sense of national community and the rise of this. So, for example, if you have a situation where you have a stripping away of these national myths, and you just get to a situation of individualism, and there's a vacuum there, then I think that then allows new theologies to move in, such as what I call left modernism, which is sort of this culturalized version of the left, focusing on identity groups, sacralizing them. That then can move in as a new religion, simply because there's probably a certain demand for something that is absolute, perfect moral clarity, zero ambiguity. People like that kind of very, very simple worldview. So I think that it probably sets the stage, clears the brush for the emergence of this. But ultimately, I think it is about, I'm more of a supply sider, I guess. I would say that it's an ideology. It's like a meme, it's like a virus, which has its own evolutionary paths, which is developed in its own direction post the late 60s. And at that sort of cultural level, it's like a virus. It infects people who then spread it elsewhere. And that, I think, is more the way to think about it, is that. And so you almost need to have some kind of antibody that can fight it and that can counter it at that cultural level. But of course, political and institutional resources are going to matter in that cultural fight as well, which is where the idea of regulating and penetrating institutions is important as well. But no, I don't think this is about religion or lack of religiosity playing the key role. So, I mean, the U.S. is a much more religious society than Eastern Europe. Eastern Europe has very little wokeness. Of course, there are many factors that are involved here. East Asia has very little wokeness and is very non-religious. But still, I mean, I think it's interesting to think about, but I don't think it's the main driver.
Mhm. Yeah, like you're exactly right. That's what I always said. The United States is the only first world country right now, as far as I'm concerned, that is really overwhelmingly religious. I think like 79% of people still consider themselves to be some part
Right.
of Christian, which is pretty high, 79 or 72, one of those. Um, but yeah,
Yeah.
Dr. Kaufman, I want to thank you endlessly for giving me this opportunity to speak with you. It's been fantastic. I love this conversation.
Vincent, thanks very much. I've enjoyed it just as much.